of my favorite podcasts, Search Engine with PJ Vogt, did a very interesting episode this week titled "How Did the First Democracy Die?" It was about the kind of rise and fall of democracy in Athens, and was primarily an interview with this professor and author, Lauren Sammons, who wrote a book called What's Wrong with Democracy. And I thought I'd just share like some of my big takeaways from that to kind of preface our conversation. The first thing to note about Athens is that it was a direct democracy, which meant that all the citizenry were allowed to go in and vote, most of which were like selected at random to be representatives. And in this kind of like direct democracy model, they got to vote on a lot of things, including who they exiled every year from Athens, which is wild to think about. But also things like how Athens should spend its money. And essentially the premise of the podcast was that Athens eventually died because the masses, when given the power of the purse, right, to vote on what things Athens would use its coffers for, paid themselves to do a bunch of things they probably shouldn't have paid themselves to do. Lived a too lavish of a lifestyle. They paid themselves to vote. They paid themselves to go to the theater. And eventually they just kind of started to run out of money and had to keep fighting wars in order to like increase their, war chests and keep up the good times. And eventually they just lost so many of those wars. And the Macedonians came in and said, no more democracy. I thought that was so fascinating. And at the end of this podcast, Lauren Sammons poses a question that I thought would be interesting for us to kind of like talk about as people who have done a few episodes on like democracy at work and all these things. I think that's a value we both align with. But he said, I find it hilarious that people think democracy is somehow the ultimate form of government. Judging a democracy by how democratic it is doesn't work. We have to judge it by how well it reaches our goals of justice and goodness. And I think the same can be said for our companies. It's interesting to think about, is democracy the final form of both governance for, this country, for, countries at large, and governments in general? And even, is it something that we should be advocating for in our companies, or is there something else out there? So I thought that would just be a nice story to tease up the conversation. But what are your thoughts on this, Henry?
Yeah, I love history. I love podcasts about podcasts. I love all this stuff. A lot of time, I liked that quote that you just read off of we should judge a democracy by almost its morals. I often think about judging a country or a company or a form of government as the prosperity that it brings. Typically, when we hear that word, we think about economic, but I think there's also such a thing as moral prosperity, right? So
Yeah.
you can say we're going to maximize the gain, but also minimize the harm in order to have this nice answer of prosperity. Couple things to react to the classical Athens history is, number one, the direct democracy was a progression, right? Like gradually they expanded the vote. I am super curious about learning more about this kind of ancient period of history and if there's any justification for why democracy sprung up in this one place and seemingly nowhere else in the time period. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like, why isn't classical China a democracy? Like, what is unique about Athens almost is a question I would have, because it seems so natural in the history.
I agree. And this is a question that I was having while I was listening to the podcast, because the way they also made it seem is that like Athens kind of had nothing else going for it.
Yeah.
Like they're not mentioned in any of the like major kind of Greek works. Like there's a joke that they talk about in the podcast that Athens had like a big chip on its shoulder in the Odyssey, like Homer's Odyssey, where like there's like one character from Athens, and like nothing else happens there, or like they're kind of
Yeah.
like irrelevant to the story. And that in some writings, some documents from the time period, that this was kind of a similar to like Philadelphia, like kind of a thing that was like a chip on their shoulder of like, the forgotten people, the forgotten city in Greece. But you're right that they were the ones to kind of like create this, what we see now as like an idealized form of government.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I have no idea why. Like, I think that's such an interesting question. Like, what are the conditions? And then to think about like, what are the conditions that are not present today, maybe to like advocate for a democracy. And the thing I think about so often, how is it similar or different to the development of like democratic workplace structures
Hmm.
in history? And a lot of that comes down to um, like people feeling powerless and oppressed, right, and wanting to claw back power to themselves,
Yeah.
not as individuals but as a group. That's kind of like when Robert Owen and like these other kind of political economists developed kind of like the mainstream corporation and the co-op. That's what was happening at the time. Kind of like this tension of income inequality from like what we're becoming, what we know as kind of like the hyper capitalist entrepreneurs in the Industrial Revolution. Um, yeah, it's super interesting. I think there's a lot to be learned. Obviously, this is like a hard time to be learning those things, right? Because we are feeling that our own democracy is under threat. And not to be too political on the podcast, but like Henry and I are really pro democracy. Like, it's crazy that that's something like that seems like a political argument in this country, but yeah, it's wild.
I try to be. I really do. I would also maybe push back. We had a conversation earlier in the week off air about, you know, maybe democracy isn't as influential in the United States' prosperity as we may think, almost as
Yeah.
pushback to American exceptionalism. I
Hmm.
might apply that same thinking to ancient Athens in that they didn't fall because their populace voted in their own self interest. They fell because their military was too weak. Like,
Mm.
that could just
I
be
think
as
I think
simple.
there's some I think there's some interconnectedness there. Like, I'm absolutely no expert. I've listened to one podcast, but it seems like the story is not so much just that they fell from military might, but that the reason they fell from military might, and because they had stretched themselves so thin. In terms of like military and the wars that were going on, was a lot because they were spending too much money and needed war to claw back some cash.
Yeah. And then in that, if you walk down that logical endpoint, democracy or direct democracy inherently does not check spending. Spending will
Yeah,
go unchecked. Everyone will get everything for free if you allow them to vote. Should you have this for free or do you want to pay for it?
yeah, exactly. It's a very kind of like, I feel like conservative argument, but like lowercase c, right? That it's very easy to vote to spend other people's money. And if you give, power of the purse to the populace, they will spend the money that is available to them through the government. And that's one of the points that Sammons talks about in the podcast is this kind of trend of that you kind of even see in our own country, like of overspending. Like everybody keeps talking about the deficit, the amount of money that we like take on it as debt, and like all this stuff. There's a lot more. Like, we are not experts. Please go read a book on this or something. Don't just listen to this podcast. But like, there's a lot of reasons that we're spending like all this money, and whether or not it's good or bad is like completely subject to which economist you talk to. But in general, the idea that if given money for more social services for groups of people that vote, we will get those. Um, and whether that's sustainable long term, all that stuff. This is very similar to a conversation I think we had one of the first episodes of the podcast about like democracy at work, right? Talking about co-ops, is this worry around like direct democracy in business. Like, what I think the thing that you had said was like, why should the it wasn't the shoe shiner or something, like what was the thing you said, what was the persona, why should they vote on like what the costs of goods are for like some other expenses,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
people aren't educated, like all that stuff, like does that make any sense? And I think the thing that I had brought up is I completely agree with you, and like that's why we focus on representative democracy, right? Like really, it's simply the idea of like being able to choose your leaders. But as even we're seeing right now in the world, being able to choose your leaders can often seemingly have people vote not in their own self-interest, right? Like there's a lot of like magnanimous personality, charisma that goes into that. So I don't know. It's a tough thing. It's a tough call.
Yeah. To add on the layer of startup culture, one of our favorite buzzwords is the pivot, right? So
Yes.
you always got to be ready to pivot. You pivot to survive. Same thing when we're talking about collections of people, right? Challenges arise. You want your leaders to be able to pivot and react. That's why we want to, in a democratic system, elect qualified and responsible leaders that we trust to ethically navigate those pivots, right? So
Hmm.
I think applying that concept of democracy to a company makes a lot of sense. But the direct democracy that, you know, forced Athens to be taken over and burned to the ground, I think is something we should probably avoid in both countries and companies.
Yeah. Something that I was thinking about when writing notes for this episode, like I'm such a kind of pro co-op democracy at work person. The thing that I still struggle with though is that people still vote in their own self-interest. And if we think if of our previous episode of like what do you do when you realize your company is causing harm, like co-ops don't really solve for that, right? There's still not this idea that the employees of the company, even if they do have voice, they're not going to voice for seemingly like catastrophic ethical decisions that are going, or for ethical decisions that will cause like the company's downfall, like in some catastrophic way. Um, like those incentives still exist no matter how many people at the company they affect. And in some ways, if you give employees like greater ownership, there's more people who would be hurt from things like whistleblowers, like people that are like trying to publish information and make companies more transparent. I don't know. Have you thought about that at all? And like, am I touching on anything that you've thought about or have opinions on?
The question is, how do you establish ethical decision making in a company?
Yeah, like it seems even adding a layer of democracy, which is the same thing we're seeing, in our own government, um, doesn't necessarily equate, or even if we think about it to Athens, like doesn't necessarily equate to better decisions for like the world at large, more just decisions that benefit the people inside of them, the people with the ownership and control. And it feels to me that like even if you spread out that ownership and control over a larger group of people, in the case of a co-op, it doesn't solve for like these business ethical decisions that we focus so much on this podcast, or making those easier. If anything, I think in terms of the societal benefit, it makes them in some cases harder, unless you have the people, like all stakeholders have a vote, like, which is the idea of um like public ownership of companies, right? Which is kind of like an extreme view in this country and hard to advocate for, and hard to advocate for in a podcast aimed at entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I of course have thought a lot about this, but it's super complicated, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
about to go on a multi-minute long diatribe about it, but essentially I will say as short as I can, democracy, dictatorship, authoritarianism, communism, I don't know if any of those models are going to be the best at promoting the goodness or the
Hmm.
morality of a collection of people or companies. I think that leaders are incredibly important. Having
Hmm.
good leaders is what we have always strived to do, I hope, in the past. We want a leader that's going to represent us and make the world a better place. Lots of different paths to get there, but I really believe that leaders are important. Again, to tie back to the pivot, you want to trust somebody. You know, I have a day job. Everyone around us has a day job. We can't be responsible for navigating, you know, how should we structure a police force and how should we, guide our international policy. Like, we want to trust someone else. We want to specialize that to someone else. Um, but what I do know is that democracy seems like a really good way of keeping leaders accountable,
Hmm. And getting
but
them out.
and getting them out, which is the key.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you can also have a byproduct of people voting in their own self-interest. To tie it to the latest presidential election, it seems
Hmm.
people voted for change, as they did all around the world. People voted in their own self-interest, not necessarily to promote goodness for the
Hmm.
world or for their neighbors or for themselves. They just kind of voted for change. And it
Yep.
seems like we have now elected a unquestionably morally flawed individual to lead the United States.
Yep.
That's a negative outcome in my view, because we want to promote goodness. But also, if you want to promote goodness, democracy is a good check. Laws are a good check. We kind of think about laws as guiding morality. But at the end of my diatribe, I will say it's really hard to have effective laws and democracy when wealthy corporations can influence both those things.
Yep.
So if that's the pursuit we want to have, is democracy will check our leaders and laws will keep them morally accountable, we need to get money out of politics, folks. Like, that, I think, would be the aim. And I think you could apply that to companies as well. Have your laws, have representative leaders in your company,
Hmm.
but probably don't go all the way to direct democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's it.
Um, it's like a good reminder. I think the through theme of kind of what we're talking about in this episode is that democracy itself, in itself, does not, promote justice, goodness. Back to the like Lauren Sammons quote. Um, it's more a way of trying to balance and change the dynamics of power, right? Um, and yeah, as we saw in this election, to us, right, we did not vote in terms of justice and goodness. Um, yeah, I like what you said. Like, people voted for change. I think that's totally true. And yeah, the point about like money in politics, influence in politics. I was listening to, um, I don't often, but it came across my feed. A16Z's podcast, Andreessen Horowitz, their podcast. Man, do I not like those guys. But they did a podcast episode that's quite had a quite inflammatory title of like why Trump is so good for startups. And
Oh
the
my
thumbnail had
goodness.
like let's build and like all this stuff on it. And they spent about an hour talking about why Trump is going to be so good for crypto companies. Um, which is just like such a bizarre thing. Actually, the first 10 minutes was a lot of Mark Andreessen talking about how he's been repressed for 4 years. And I think he meant oppressed and just has never been oppressed in his life. And so did not know the exact word to use
And
as a, white cis male billionaire. But I digress. Uh, it made me think about kind of your last point regarding money in politics. They talked about how their like super PAC had like 56 wins and 4 losses in all of the like um downstream elections, they were also supporting all the candidates. Um, and it just made me feel like I was watching two out of touch people with way too much influence. Like, and it's so crazy to think that those people are the main voices in our industry.
Mhm.
Like, these are the people talking to startup founders. Like, when we think about like radicalization culture and how like subliminal that kind of starts. Like,
Yeah.
if you're a college founder and you're looking at like the top startup podcasts, I think it's um what is the one that the guy from All In does? Um like it's startup something. I can't remember. I'm blanking on what it is. But it's that one, All In, and uh, the A16Z podcast and the Y Combinator podcast,
Yeah.
all directed by people who haven't started companies in like 20 years. First of all, um, people who are completely out of touch with the like social and political landscape of our world. Like, and this is not me like tooting our horn like we're so important. It's
No, I know
more
nothing.
me. Yeah, yeah, we know nothing. But it's more simply me saying it's like the amount of influence that these people have not only on our culture but on the culture of the United States is scary. Um, yeah.
Yeah, you could chalk it up to, money being able to buy you influence in the digital age. Like, you could
Hmm.
chalk it up to that. You could say that investors wield a lot of power in order to
Totally.
attract attention, and
Yeah.
couple that with the digital age, they're going to be the loudest voices. Um, I think about potential solutions to that. If you want more grounded individuals motivating the next generation, how do you get there? Like,
Hmm.
it's very similar to, if you have a leader, or let's say tie it to a company. We have a leader of a really big corporation and we want to get them out. Okay, let's have a vote and, get this CEO out of here. They have to give up their power, right? Because they
Hmm.
have ownership in the company. So, how do you create a system that allows you to bring more democracy to elect your manager or your leader of the company?
Yep.
It seems like you need institutional change just to open that up. And it probably, I say institutional, it's about ownership at the end of the day. Like,
Yep.
that's fundamental. Um, I'm not as much of a revolutionary as you are, but I do want,
Unionize your workplace. Start a union. Take power back.
we're going to get canceled here. So just, yeah. But to try to keep us on the air for a bit
I have a
longer.
whole article of what I'm working on why entrepreneurs should be pro union. But I digress. Keep going.
All right. All right. I'm with you most of the way. I wonder, how do you promote the voices that you want to? It sounds
Yep.
hard. It sounds hard to kind of strip power and influence away from the out of touch elite, as you said. But isn't this a tale as old as time? Like, it just
Hmm.
seems like, man, if you try to tie in some every man and woman is equal communist, you then have to sacrifice specialization and expertise and like care for specific industries and skills. That leads to ruin, it seems. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, it seems like the underlying issue that you're having is ownership leads to negative moral outcomes, but the alternative seems to lead to more physically negative outcomes, if that makes sense. I don't know. Maybe that was too much of a simplification, but I wonder, how do you thread the needle on that and maybe strike a balance?
Yeah. And I think obviously like it was meant to be a simplification, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think the struggle really is around like property, right? Like ownership. if there are some people, that get to own the land in which we all use, right? Like, even that fundamentally um, causes issues, right? And that's why we have like this strange system in the US, um, where, and like laws that try to reclaim public lands, right? Like, we understand sometimes that like reclaiming this decrepit building and turning it into a park will be good for society, and so sometimes your state government just gets to say, "Up, this is what we're gonna do as a community," right?
Mhm.
Like, and the question becomes like, where where does that end? Where is the line? Like, and how do you claim power back without uh, either like physical or like in some ways like social harm and violence, which is the thing that like um the like mild Quaker in me, the mild pacifist is like struggles with,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
it's hard. It's a hard thing, and it's like fundamentally what we want to do here, right? Like entrepreneurs, founders, all that stuff, we just want to make stuff, right? Like, we want to use this medium as a form of creative expression, in order to carve out. I think the quote is like, to carve out a little place in the universe, right? That's the Steve Jobs quote, and make it our own, and also like make it our own in a way that's like a gift to others. At least that's how I think about it.
Yeah.
Um,
Impactful.
Impactful, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And hard it's hard to think about impact um, as only positive when you start to reveal behind the curtain of all the injustice that happens, in kind of like the systems of ways that like uh, money, companies, power, like um, do so much harm. Yeah,
And
it's a tough thing.
yeah, I don't want to cut you off, but I think that's why I come back to the idea of leaders are important because I
Yeah.
want people like you to lead companies. And if you make a lot of money and you feel bad about that, I exploited people, I made too much money. What do I do now?
Mhm.
That's a good problem to have. Like, I would rather you be making those decisions, feeling that guilt, than somebody who doesn't feel that guilt or doesn't care.
Yeah.
And
Who
so I
doesn't think
think,
about the injustice?
yeah,
Yeah.
like the
I think that's totally right. And to your point about like voting, or to point about leadership, right? Like, I think that's the big thing with democracy, right?
Mhm,
Like, it's fundamentally like what you were saying kind of halfway through this segment. Like, that's the beautiful thing, is it's a way of choosing leadership. It's choosing values, and right now we don't have that in companies, and we also still see that even when you do have that power in democracy, um, the leaders people can choose are sometimes not maybe what we'd want to have as the pinnacle of values for our communities,
mhm,
and that's a hard thing.
yeah. I
So
I
if
think it's
anybody
just
wants to sign up for our petition to vote out Mark Zuckerberg as the CEO of Meta,
we got big problems
so
right now.
we got social media companies are countries and should be seen as such. But Henry, speaking of this idea of like leaders choosing the kind of directions, the values that companies hold, let's talk about mission, vision, and value statements. Um, what is your experience, Henry, with mission, vision, and value statements?
Yeah, I to be honest, never have spent a lot of time on this. I mean, in my life, I've written dozens of business
Mm,
plans. I went to business school. I had a minor in entrepreneurship. I participated in a lot of pitch competitions. The idea of a mission statement was never, I guess, forced upon me strong enough to adopt it, but it kind of just seemed like a distraction to me. Um, But with that being said, I have open ears to be, encouraged to put more value on this because the pivot is so important, right? You're going to navigate so many things. The concept of having a declared vision to, keep you morally guided or headed in the right direction. Maybe not morally, but just like, hey, we have a purpose. We're going in this direction, no matter how we might weave and bob. Um, I'm open to it, but it's always been something that I think is a little nebulous, a little foo-foo. Like we just need to think problem and solution, right? But yeah, that's my experience.
So what's interesting is I'm coming in, I think, with the completely opposite experience.
Sweet.
Um, I have spent more time than I care to admit crafting mission, vision, and values for the companies that I've started in the past. I participated in a series of accelerator programs, and the two things that I learned from those are how to raise money and how to write a mission statement. And you might be thinking, right, like based on the premise that you just teased up, that I'm going to be coming in here and spouting the virtues of, mission, vision, and value statements. But in reality, I think that both of those lessons learned, how to raise money and how to write a mission statement, was really just all talk, right? Like how to spin a good story enough that an investor wants to invest in your company, or your customers feel comfortable enough purchasing your product. I want to give like a little brief history of kind of this concept of mission, vision, and values, because I think it will be helpful to understand like why this is so baked into our current company culture. And then we'll tease up like why I think that they're not as useful as we make them out to be. So the mission and vision and value statements emerged in like the mid 20th century, so like 1960s ish, from a lot of management theories of like Peter Drucker and those like kind of areas. That's big influence into like what then became like corporate social responsibility in the 90s and 2000s, because of the fallout of like a lot of things, including the dot-com like bubble bursting, and also a lot of the like Reaganomics policies that turned the 80s and 90s into like an absolute hellscape of capitalism, much very similar to what we have now. And also, like as competition increased, like as we globalized our economy, the mission and vision statements and like focus on like who you're buying from, and what do they stand for, became more important. This was uh, this is kind of like a key differentiator between, people often compare like today with like the 1970s in terms of like the beatnik movements and all that stuff. It's just that in the 1970s, the idea was don't buy anything. And now it's, oh, buy from the people that are B Corps. But I hate to burst somebody's bubble, but like Nestle is a B Corp.
Sure.
like these concepts really mean so little. And like, that's why and like I was baked into this culture, right? Like I wanted to, I'm me, right? Like imagine me trying to start a startup, 6 years ago, right? Like feeling all the guilt and shame I do now, but just in an actual like pressure cooker of like, you
Come up
you
with your
need to build.
values.
Yes, you need to build a $1
Yeah.
billion company, and like the tension that would create. And so my outlet was the mission, vision, and values statements that I could write, right? That I could show people that no, I actually am a good person.
Yeah.
But in reality, like what actually happens is companies write these down, and there's so much like baked into like company culture, and like this is culture is what happens when nobody's looking and blah blah blah. But fundamentally, companies are not designed, they're not baked in a system that to fulfill whatever is on their mission statement, right? The thing they are designed to do is especially public companies, turn profits and grow. And if anything is, and this is not to simplify this for anybody that has to go through that, it's just what the incentive structures are. If anything is in the way of that, even if it aligns with the company mission and all this stuff, the company mission will change. The vision and values can be rewritten. These things are not written in stone. These actual systems in which our companies operate are. They're written in law. And so those are the things that actually affect how we run our companies way more than mission, vision, and values. It's a very cynical take, Henry. But that is actually how I feel.
I hate to just come back to the same thing, but I think if you're concerned about the moral compass of corporations and companies as they grow and prosper, it comes back to leaders, right? I think
Exactly.
having profits can sometimes feel not good, but if you feel that way, you're probably the best person to decide what to do with those profits. Are you going to give it back to the community? Are you going to give it back to the employees? Are you going to do something that would make you proud, right? Like not
Mm-hmm.
just taking the easy path and enriching the investors or
Or
enriching the
yourself.
share or enriching yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but actually being generous and doing something that is a mission, vision, promoting a good, strong value, right? I think,
Exactly. Take action, because otherwise it is
yeah,
all talk.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so it's hard. I hear the cynicism of like, hey, there are incentives in place in order to guide companies and leaders down a path of profit, because if you don't have economic success, you simply don't exist. So,
Exactly.
like, that is unavoidable. But I think the caveat is if you do find yourself existing, you've checked off the first box, you now have the responsibility to promote better values, a better mission, something that is
Mm-hmm.
morally guided to make the world a better place, right? You have the responsibility to make a positive impact because you've already passed level 1. Don't get stuck on level 1.
Yeah. And don't jump to level 2 because you think it will help you with level 1.
No.
I think that,
Good
like
point.
all these accelerator programs that we spent like 2 weeks with like consultants coming in, helping us write all this stuff. It's all marketing. It's a marketing workshop, right?
Mhm.
And honestly, like no one is going to read your about page. Like people are going to pay attention to how you make them feel and what you're doing. That is fundamentally the way you build the most trust with customers in the beginning. No one is going to buy your product because of what your mission statement says. Like, and so don't spend time on it. Like, it, I think that people would have expected me to come with like that this is the most important thing, right? That like you gotta focus on it, you gotta bake it into the way that you work and blah blah blah. And like I sympathize with people that share those feelings, right? I'm friends with many of those people, and I think they do fantastic work in trying to do what we're talking about here, step 2 of going into companies and saying, hey, you probably should think about what you want to do to share your success, right? What is the end goal of you existing? Like that's probably something that you want to flesh out and cement and talk about internally so that you can take actions. But the
Mhm.
actions are the thing that speak so much louder than words. And if you only focus on the words, you're missing the entire point. Um, I I especially am so cynical and frustrated by this because it is so common for like accelerator startup educators, all these things to, I think, use this as a tactic to make founders feel like their companies are designed to do good, right? That if I write it in my mission statement, if I outline my vision and values, then I can shed some of this like guilt and responsibility because look, my company exists to do this thing. And so any justification for what we do to get there is like all bets are off. And I think that is so dangerous.
Mm.
And it's a
Yeah.
lie.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. That's frustrating. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that last part of, okay, anything goes, well, that really promotes your likelihood of success in level 1, right? To
Yeah,
just say,
right.
morally, I could do anything because in level 2, I'm going to make it all better. All right.
Exactly.
So, like with the actual economic problems, that really gives you complete moral freedom, which
License.
dangerous. Yeah. We don't
Yeah.
love that. So, I understand why you would be frustrated with leaders teaching the next generation that that is okay.
Hmm.
Um, I,
Or that this is the only way,
mhm.
right? Like if someone came in, like the first company I worked at, when like Lumastic imploded and I needed a job, was one of our advisors got me a job at this consulting company. And something that I thought was amazing that they did, a small consulting company, I think it was like 20 something people when I started there. And even then, they were a profitable company that every single month donated, I think, $5,000 to a charity voted on by the employees. And
Pretty cool.
just that, just little thing, right? I don't even think we had a mission statement. If we did, I don't know what it was.
Mhm.
Like, which is
Yeah.
the complete opposite of what all of these like cultural consultants will go and to accelerator programs and all these things to talk about, right? Like the actions mattered more, right? I felt like it was a like safe, good place to work full of people that just wanted to build stuff and then provide back to their community in a way that made us all feel like good about having to work every day of our lives.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and that's the important part. It's the actions that you take. And so if somebody had come in to like one of the accelerators I was in and said like, hey, like I mean, obviously this would have fallen on deaf ears because no one was making any money. But like, hey, you know what you should do with all the riches that you're gonna like gather because you're a hyper growth startup that you're the best and that you made it into this accelerator program, whatever. You should think about how to start like a nonprofit fund or like support your open source maintainers, like all this stuff. Never brought up, right? It's write
Yeah.
it down and put it on your website. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like the idea of thinking about it as very separate. Our primary mission is to be successful in the market. Our secondary and
To
separate
be
mission,
economically sustainable.
yeah.
like,
Once we have that sustainability to exist, then
mhm.
what do we do to make a better impact? That
Yeah.
that's nice. Like that seems approachable and realistic. You're not putting the cart in front of the horse. You're not saying,
No.
"Hey, I need to say I'm going to give away a pair of shoes for every one that I sell up front in order to justify my existence." Just
Yeah.
make a really good shoe, have success, and then we can consider that level 2. Um, it seems like a wiser, more efficient use of resources almost.
Yeah.
Um,
And is self-conscious of the system that we are operating in as entrepreneurs. Right? That this system does not exist for us to do good. It is an after effect that we must choose and fight for if that is what we want to do with our companies. Um, and that it is subservient always to economic sustainability, not dramatic economic success, right? Economic sustainability.
yeah.
Um, to talk more about this, I'm going to transition us to our last topic, Henry. I wanted to vent more than I have about why it's so hard to register a co-op in the United States. Um, for those of you that don't know, co-ops are a form of corporate governance in which all members, so employees or sometimes consumers, get a vote for like the leadership and sometimes like other things with how the company operates. And it's rad as hell. You can find out more information at start.coop. But Sarah and I are working to, or looking ahead to maybe think about transforming not-for-profit apparel, the like bulk t-shirt buying company that I've started, into a real consumer cooperative, so that people would like pay a like membership, get to vote on like the stuff that we sell, the suppliers we use, how like the amount of like reinvestment back into the business, all that stuff, just seems to make sense. And then I did research about this years ago when I was thinking about turning Lumastic into a co-op, but it feels like it's gotten even worse. A co-op, to start an LLC, let's first do that, which is what we are now, not for profit, or it's called Chickadee Apparel LLC, but I'm doing business as not for profit apparel. You need one person, $50, and 15 minutes on an online form. You'll get your articles of organization. You'll get your tax identification number. You'll get everything. Boom, you're donezo. All you have to do is know what you want to name your company. To start a co-op, you need 5 people committed to being on your board. You need about 8 weeks to fill out all of the forms and do all the paperwork, and for the SEC of whatever state you live in to do all the filing. And you likely, because that is such a complicated process, need to pay about $3,000 to a lawyer in legal fees. And the question is just what the hell are we communicating to founders, to our society at large, if those two things are so disparate and difficult? A co-op is not even an organization that is listed as one that you can register as on the Virginia SEC website. It is buck wild.
Yeah.
But to your point about economic sustainability, then what are you going to do about it? Right? I think this is somewhere in the middle, right? We are economically sustainable in the way that Sarah and I are volunteering our time right now to make this business happen. But we've sold nearly $700 now in shirts for the first order, closing it. But it will be closed by the time that you listen to this episode. But if you sign up for my newsletter, you can be notified about the winter order. And so we're thinking ahead of okay, if this is going to grow, right? If this is going to continue to be kind of a sustainable side thing that Sarah and I do every 3 months for a week, how do we make sure that it aligns with the values that we want to support? And it's just crazy that the action, right, that we want people probably to take more, is so difficult, and it only leads me to believe that it's not an action we want people to take. That's the unfortunate truth, is that we don't want there to be more co-ops in the United States, which is why we make it so difficult for them to be organized. That's the only conclusion I can come to, and I think that that's crazy.
Yeah, we don't want it. I think one of the trends that has happened in Western society, probably promoted first and foremost by the United States, is convenience and low-cost goods. McDonald's on every corner, Starbucks on every corner. You get your groceries on every corner. Everything is very accessible, standardized, and therefore, and in addition, affordable. Co-ops are more attuned, in my mind, as community run, local, mom and pop. That's not the trend. But what I will say is, as goods have gotten more expensive, that value of the big box company and corporation on every corner is starting to irritate people. The fact that a low-income family can't go to McDonald's and feed their family for under $100, that pisses people off. And so I think we could see almost a rise of this demand for more local, more community run, more co-ops, because the promise of this American trend of standardized, convenient, and affordable is broken right now. It's not affordable. It's not affordable, and it's not gonna get affordable because of the economic incentives we've talked about. So
exactly.
I will say you're upset, but I might be out on a limb and predict maybe that
there's
will
hope.
soften up. Yeah, maybe there's hope, because the current paradigm seems to be letting people down in a really big way, and this could be the solution.
Yeah, I wrote an article last week about how to be politically active, and it's comparing how do you bake in political activity and being part of your democracy into your weekly routine, like exercise. And I, in that article, posed like, you got to pick a thing that you want to fight for, dedicate time for, carve out time for, and do for a long time at the sacrifice of other stuff, which is the hardest part. And some people make you feel bad about picking one thing or the other. I think that's ridiculous. But I have chosen for now, like housing in my local community, like fighting for more affordable housing to like try to quell the amount of economic insecurity and homelessness in the Charlottesville community. But there's a part of me that has two other things on my targets or in my sights. One of them is trying to get it to be way, way easier to file as a cooperative business in this state. The second one is making my local university pay property taxes, but that's a whole other issue.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, yes, to your point, I think that there is some like optimism and hope. There is a trend for seemingly what people want. The flip side, the harder thing to internalize is when you're mentioning companies like McDonald's, all that stuff that like the US has focused so much on like optimizing for decreased in price, even sometimes at the sacrifice of quality. Like our quality bar is pretty low in the United States, specifically too for food. And we see anything that prevents prices from being driven down as like a form of antitrust. or trust busting. Like that's when the trust busters come in. It's bad for consumers. It's anti-consumer. But just like in this case, right? Like the thing that seemingly is good for people, good for our local communities, all that stuff, kind of cooperative ownership structures, community-run businesses. That thing is insanely expensive. That's Whole Foods, right? The thing that's cheap, far less nutritious, not good for you, organized by massive corporations. That's the thing that's cheap and accessible. And that sucks. It sucks that that's the way that our economy optimizes, like companies to run and for like consumer behavior. But to your point, I agree. I think that there is hope that maybe that script can be flipped. Maybe we can make the thing that's good for us cheaper, potentially by making the thing that's bad for us more expensive. Is the hard thing that no one ever wants to talk about, and no one wants to vote for a politician that says that. But yeah, I think that's like a thing to champion. And if you want to be part of that championing, if you're listening to this and are focused on like promoting more co-ops, go to start.coop, talk to my man Greg over there. He's great. I'm gonna at some point try to get him to come on the show. But Henry, do you have any like final thoughts before we wrap on like this problem?
I think that it's a real problem when you think about, okay, what's the solution to making quality goods more affordable? It seems to be regulation. Like you need politics. You need to, increase the purchasing power of the middle class, grow the middle class so that they can consume more high quality, healthy, good things, whether it's services or goods, whatever. And that's why I think today's episode was so political, is because business and politics is so connected. And
they're synonymous.
They're the same thing. And so if you're like, I'm a startup founder and I'm an entrepreneur or I'm a business leader, I don't care about politics, I'm a centrist. Politics is incredibly important to establishing the market, to protecting customers, to protecting investors. It protects everybody. So you kind of need to advocate for the laws that you want, because as we said, you have to pass level 1, and that is surviving in the market and, making a profit, really. So you want that market to be regulated in your favor.
Yes. Sorry to cut you off. No. Just from what you said, it reminded me of something that I wrote down like a year ago. But the act of starting a business is an act of economic and political protest. you venturing out into the market to make something that you want to see, to undercut competition, to fight against the big guy, whatever it is, whatever is driving and motivating you, that is an act of economic and political protest against an established player. And so the idea that you can believe that politics has no place in business, which is a very common theme when Trump was elected in 2016, is a delusion. And it's important that we don't lie to ourselves and we don't lie to others about what our role is in shaping the way that our democracy in America and the democracies across the world and the governments across the world work. Huge, huge, huge episode, Henry. Huge for us. So political. Yeah, we never talk about politics. We never talk about sensational, like hot takes
Yep.
around democracy.
Not too sorry
uh,
about it, but
not too sorry, but if you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe to us here on YouTube. Henry and I would love also to hear your comments or to read your comments down below about anything we talked about in this episode.